Thanks to Ellie from all of us for pulling today together. This comes out of her own sort of personal research fund at Kent, but in classic Ellie style, it's very collaborative and trying to bring us all together. So it's very much appreciated. Anyway, I'm just going to kick off. Is that really loud? Sorry. No, it's not. If it's horribly loud for people online or anything, then please put something in the chat. There are a few comments in the chat. I don't know if you need to. Is that cool? Okay, so changes to what has been termed parenting culture by people like Ellie have now become a fairly well-established field of social science scholarship. And this research has been sort of largely based on in Euro-American settings, but it's kind of called attention to this intensification of parenting, particularly in the last 40, 50 years, suggesting that raising children has become, culturally at least, a more demanding and complex task. The majority of research in this area has looked at the effect of these changes on individuals, and particularly on women. Mothers more than fathers are recognised as increasingly kind of torn by the competing expectations to parent intensively on the one hand, whilst participating in the labour market in the other. More recent work has documented the experiences of men grappling with shifting ideals of a more kind of intensive, involved fatherhood. But no research really has looked at the impact of these changes on couples. And that's where my book comes in. And this sort of focuses on couple relationship in the context of an intensified parenting culture, reporting on a longitudinal study that I did quote here, with 20 couples becoming parents in London over a 5-year period. And I think this is a particularly interesting historical moment at which to observe couples' experiences of the transition to parenthood, because at the policy level at least, there's been growing commitment to gender equality, especially insofar as childcare responsibilities relate to men and women's career prospects and what's called work-life balance. Parental leave and flexible working are two of the key policy responses under the auspices that sharing responsibility for childcare, traditionally assumed by women, will reduce gender differentials in terms of career professional pay. The couples that I'm talking about in the book are all professionally employed, and the vast majority are heterosexual first-time parents. There is a subsample of other parents, but I'm not going to talk about them today. And the central chapters sort of take as the starting point the practices and the issues which flow from them of birth, feeding, and sleep. Three pretty heated topics in contemporary parenting culture. And these are practices of parenting which to varying degrees are unavoidable, as Ella says, and also on a sliding scale of physiology. Birth might be said to be nearly 100% physiological, particularly as all of the mothers in this sample were birth mothers, whereas feeding is only potentially constrained by physiology if women are breastfeeding or expressing milk, or doing that in combination with the use of formula milk. Sleeping practices, by contrast, are not necessarily tied to physiology at all, but they often seem to be. As such, these practices provide a quite interesting spectrum, which are highly physiologically constrained at one end and more socially constrained at the other. And obviously they overlap a bit. But secondly, they are topics that are discussed at length by professionals and experts, which are central to contemporary social policy, connecting to debates around gender, workload, distribution, and intimacy. And finally, birth, feeding, and sleep can also be seen as the first sort of major parenting issues, which are dealt with, as varying matters of urgency. You sort of have to feed a baby pretty damn fast after they come out. These are practices which therefore help establish a pattern of behaviour between parents, namely who, how, when, and why one or other parent will respond. And as work on the structuring principles suggests, it's also the case that these early patterns can be quite hard to break. So overall, the research sort of in the book shows that new parents are kind of caught in a fairly uncomfortable confluence between two competing discourses, those around ideal relationships and those around ideal parenting. On the one hand, they must be committed to kind of egalitarian ideals about being equal partners. On the other, they must be parenting intensively in ways that are markedly more demanding for mothers, as I'll go into, and which I think makes maternal involvement in particular more complicated. So today I'm going to focus on ideas around equality and the practice of feeding babies that to point to some of the problems that arise when people, individuals, couples, and obviously parents in this case, have to live and create meaning in their lives when normative assumptions are contradictory. So I'm going to sort of give you an extended case study of one couple. These are vignettes that appear in the book from 3 first-time parent couples to illustrate some of the larger themes around kind of gender, intimacy, and equality. And these are the couples who struggled most to reconcile these kind of competing narratives around relationships and parenting, and who suffered the greatest relationship breakdown. I should say they are not representative of the whole sample. They are obviously not representative of the whole population. However, given all of the resources at the disposal of these couples, the extended narratives arguably magnify and clarify tensions faced by couples making the transition to parenthood today. So I first meet Anthony and Claudia at their house in South London, whilst Claudia is, when she was 8 months pregnant with their first child. At the time, she worked as an academic at a central London university, whilst Anthony, her husband, worked in the city as an IT manager. They were a high-earning and well-educated couple. He, at that point, earned more than her, but remember, this was a while ago. Their joint household income was £150,000, and they were highly reflexive. We had 4 in-person joint interviews over the course of the next year, followed up by email exchanges at 2.5 and 5 years later. And so from the outset, it's really clear that independence was something that they valued. They socialised separately a lot, and as Claudia explained at our first meeting, the ideal of independence was something that really troubled her with regards to becoming a parent. She said, now part of this generation who hate the idea of children is sort of disgusting, and they'll come and infringe on your life. And she talks a lot about relationships. Independence is very important in all sorts of relationships, including with partners. And as an extension of that, it feels like you're not really allowed to have children because they're also dependent, and it's like not a very nice thing to happen. So this concern with maintaining independence segues into her views on gender equality in the context of their relationship, which she sees as under threat. Particularly in terms of the heavier physical burden, such as gestating, birthing, and caring for children. So she sort of says, we've definitely had lots of discussions about how it will work gender equality wise and what it actually means, because I'm carrying the baby and I'm allowed time off, so you've got this in gender balance, which I really struggled with. And her husband sort of said, well, of course you're not equal because you're biologically different. So then what is equality in this instance? And anyway, so I'm just including this to show you how reflexive she is about these ideas. But this concern was also kind of baked into their plans to even become parents. Claudia she agreed to sort of try and conceive, if her husband also signed up to the idea of sort of splitting things 50-50. So after her maternity leave, the plan was that they would both do 4-day weeks. The child would be looked after by one of them Monday and Friday, and they'd have childcare 3 days in the middle. And there was the sort of possibility of splitting parental leave, but at that point, this was before SPL came in, it was still APL, for those who know about these things, there would have been no top up from his employer either. So they decided that was not feasible. Anyway, at the point of that first interview, just before the birth of their first child, this was a couple that were highly committed to ideals of equality, with the intention that care for the baby, including feeding, be split as evenly as possible. So what happened? Well, I went back when their son was 12 weeks old exactly. He just had his jabs that day. And it was around 7 o'clock at night, which I, having now had children myself, I sort of can't believe that I suggested as an appropriate time for an interview. But anyway, they said yes. And Claudia was there, and she held the baby throughout the entire interview. I won't go into all of the details, but suffice to say, she described the early days as a continuous physical onslaught. A 53-hour labour, including induction, episiotomy, epidural, spinal fluid leakage, a hemorrhage due to retained placenta, and an infection in her uterus. Feeding the baby amidst this onslaught was also far from simple. Her nipples bled whilst breastfeeding, she pumped milk instead, but then became engorged. The baby had suspected tongue tie or reflux, and was extremely uncomfortable during feeds, very, very distressed. Eventually, after persevering with extreme pain, as she puts it, she made the awful, awful decision to use some formula milk as well as her express milk in a bottle. But by that point, the baby had developed an oral aversion, so literally wouldn't eat anything at all. In her words, every feed was frantic and miserable. Her days had no routine at all, nights were very broken, and being simplified, she had no capacity to make any decisions at all. One Friday, when her husband was actually sort of at home, she went to go and get her hair cut, only to receive a phone call from him saying, the baby won't take a bottle, and he drove the baby to her at the hairdresser, so that she could breastfeed him. At that point, they sort of just about managed to coax him back onto that. And this left her feeling, as she puts it, very much the key player, in spite of some of their intentions to be equal partners. She said to her husband, "If you can't look after him, you will bring him to me. I am in charge." And she commented, it does feel unfair that I'm at home and Anthony's not, particularly now there's no reason, because technically the baby would also take formula, but that day he decided not to. I know that's a really horrible thing to say, because it makes it sound like I don't like being with James, the baby, but it's really intense, it's really hard work, it's really mundane and boring, and it's unrelenting, and you're completely out of control, and it just doesn't suit me. When I next saw them, the baby was 6.5 months old. She had returned to, Claudia had returned to work 4 days a week, and the baby was in childcare for those 4 days. Her husband, Anthony, was at home full time though, because he'd been made redundant shortly before she went back to work. After requesting moving to a 4-day week, his boss felt he didn't have the commitment he wanted from me, and he was made sort of redundant effectively. At our final interview, when the baby was just over a year old, things had shifted again. Her husband Anthony had a new job for 5 days a week, whilst Claudia continued on 4 days. And she clearly had quite a lot of cognitive work to do around that. She said that, it's just unrealistic that he would be able to find a job that's going to fulfill him, which is still really important, and be able to do a 4-day week. It was a nice idea. I felt let down by it because I really wanted Anthony to stick to our, what was our pact before we had a baby. So in the book, what I try and do is outline some different kind of versions of equality or iterations. And here we can kind of see her shift her ideals around equality from kind of 50-50 to one more aligned with like mutual understanding or balance. And thereby sort of maintaining this ideal that this is actually still an equal relationship. But this is clearly something she kind of ruminates on and struggles with. So, Anthony was saying, "Isn't it really important I'm bringing in money to the house?" And I'm like, no, actually, that's not what matters to me. That's not what makes you an active participant in terms of equality. What I want you to do is do all the things that I do and kind of understand them as well. Unfortunately, however, this cognitive work only went so far. At a sort of more recent check-in, actually, while I was writing the book, that was actually about 7 years on, I found out that the couple had, had another son, but were actually living separately, and she was looking after the children the majority of the time. So, I'm just going to talk a little bit, and not to kind of do too much of a mini lecture about this, but just a bit about couple relationships, a bit about parenting culture, and then come back to how these kind of things clash, as we're kind of seeing. Work by people like Giddens, Bauman, Beck, and Illouz has explored shifting relationship patterns in our contemporary age, broadly sort of arguing that in a sort of period of what they call reflexive modernisation, there's been a shift away from traditional patriarchal kind of relationships based on an inherent inequality between men and women in particular, towards a more kind of equitable, mutually fulfilling model. And as part of a wider culture of individualization, you can see that this kind of independence within relationships is highly valued. Of a pure relationship, which is sort of less bound by these traditional notions of duty or obligation, depends instead on ideals of kind of communication, intimacy, and particularly equality. Now, there's a lot of social science research that points out that this is very much an ideal. It's not how people actually live their lives, but anyway, this is the kind of ideal, I think. However, parenthood within this context is arguably marked by ideas of obligation and permanence. And this, I think, sits quite uncomfortably with a more plastic approach to relationships. And so I'm kind of moving now to contemporary parenting culture. And again, I know most of you in this room are very familiar with all of this, so I'm just racing through. But what we see here is that this is not only something permanent, but therefore very, very moralized. Across the world and across history, parenting has long been subject to kind of guidance. But as becomes rapidly apparent to anyone who starts to look at raising children these days, there is this very specific language of parenting, underscored by this belief that it's a very sort of important but also really problematic sphere of life. One of the earliest and still most influential observers of this was Sharon Hose, who noticed that many of the mothers she worked with, and this is going back to the sort of mid-90s when she was doing her research in the States, was that mothers were kind of going to extreme lengths in raising their children, doing much more than what might be considered sort of necessary. It involved devoting large amounts of time, energy, and material resources to the child. This idea that the child's needs must be kind of put first, and that mothering should be child-centered. And I think within this culture, feeding babies is probably one of the most conspicuously kind of moralized elements of this sort of parenting culture, particularly in infancy, where the breast versus bottle debate looms large. And this is sort of what I looked at during my PhD, infant feeding and how it intersects with maternal identity in an unprecedented way, specifically in this kind of breast is best era, which has huge implications for women's and indeed men's, actually, I think, sense of personhood. Because of its vital importance for the survival and healthy development of infants, feeding is a highly scrutinised domain where mothers must counter any charges of practicing unusual, harmful, or morally suspect techniques. I was writing in this book about people who are attachment parents, and actually I met Ellie for the first time when she was sharing the results of this report that she just mentioned. And it occurred to me that we were kind of working with women at different ends of the spectrum. You were working with women in the very early days using formula milk, and I was working with women who might still be breastfeeding children who were 2, 3, 4, anything up to 7 years old. And it was sort of interesting, how does that spectrum, what does it tell us about the way that feeding has become moralised? So very powerful feelings about feeding are derived from the fact that it operates as this kind of signal issue. So it's more than just about a pragmatic, getting food into babies, I guess. And perhaps more than any other practice, as I said, it molds parental lifestyles, personal space, and daily rhythms, even affecting fairly fundamental categorical assumptions around gender and personhood. So as Caroline Gatrell notes in her work, women's ability to give birth and breastfeed is cited by both men and, mothers and fathers, as providing mothers with what one father described as an inbuilt advantage from the outset. And as a colleague of mine at UCL, Catherine Twomley, notes in her research with couples making the transition to parenthood, 24% of couples in her study said that they would not share parental leave because of breastfeeding. And this was certainly an important rationale that came out for the couples that I was working with as well. Usually you can explain why mothers were the ones taking longer periods of leave. But interestingly, this was the case even in instances where mothers did not end up breastfeeding, so breastfeeding didn't work out. Couples didn't then change their plans. They didn't sort of immediately say, oh, well, actually, you might as well be at home as much as me. It sort of had, cascading implications, I guess. Or rather, what emerges here is that feeding as a practice with these very variable physiological implications, it becomes a proxy for other issues in couples' negotiations around parental leave and childcare. However, many women felt that they were in a bind, in that they were, on the one hand, encouraged, as per NHS guidance, to breastfeed exclusively for 6 months and for anything up to 2 years or beyond, which is doing the best for their child, at the same time as aspiring to an equitable and intimate relationship with their partners. So where does this kind of leave us? How does it, kind of play out in people's experiences around, particularly around like work, care, and relationship kind of satisfaction in general? Now, whilst it's not typical, again, I should sort of stress this, of the majority of the responses, this one that you can see on the slide here is from Ellen, who at this point is age 45. She's just had her first baby. She's a mother who also eventually separates from her partner. And she speaks about breastfeeding in ways that magnify several of the issues that other couples mentioned. Breastfeeding was extremely satisfying, fulfilling, and comforting to me. I felt I was doing the best for my babies. It did, I should say, this is after I'm doing a follow-up interview with her at this point, so she's gone on to have 2 children. It did serve to widen the divide with my partner. He felt I should wean earlier than I wanted to because he was pressuring me to find work and have the baby sleep through the night. And I think there's several interesting things to emerge from these reflections. One is, obviously, that breastfeeding, like embodied other embodied forms of care, arguably like co-sleeping or something, can cause tension and division in relationships, not least because breastfeeding is so much more than about providing nutrition for a child, but as we said, has these cascading implications for all sorts of parenting practices. And couple intimacy, an individual sense of themselves or whatever. Second is the assumption that because men cannot breastfeed, there is no option but for the father to do less in terms of caring for the child, particularly in the early days, although this does then set up patterns further into children's infancies. Many couples claim that mothers were just sort of better and quicker at settling children at night, even once they'd stopped breastfeeding and when both had returned to work, for example. And so as the accounts here indicate, I think, the emergence of this more intensive mothering ideology has some negative implications for couples, particularly as it relates to feeding and what one mother describes as a kind of gauntlet that it lays down. In Evan's case, you could say that the husband is sort of arguably trying to de-intensify his wife's mothering in ways that he presumably believes to be beneficial to her or them as a family. So stopping breastfeeding to make it easier to sleep through the night and be able to work. But in an intensive mothering culture, which puts the child's needs at the centre, this can be read as undermining her very identity. Breastfeeding is extremely fulfilling, as she puts it. A partner who is committed to ideals of good parenting, i.e. breastfeeding, is meant to be supportive of what the partner, his partner decides to do, and suggesting otherwise is a threat to her bodily rights and therefore pressuring her. Even when men did try to help with feeding, this only seemed to kind of re-establish the mother as the one with managerial oversight, often doubling her labour, particularly if she was very committed to the baby having breast milk. As such, intensive parenting culture has the potential to displace men and make it harder for them to know how to be involved and easier for them to check out, as in the case of Anthony and Claudia, which she talks about later in our interviews, at the same time as heaping demands on women and leaving them overwhelmed. I'm just going to sort of try and pull this all together and wrap up. Collins writes about the emergence of the companionate marriage as opposed to this more kind of traditional patriarchal one, and identifies a problem with this, once children come along, because parenthood catalyses the gender division of labour and has the potential to divide companionate couples every bit as profoundly as their patriarchal counterparts along these very traditional lines. As one mother in the study sort of put it, it was birth and early parenthood that made her see her gender for the first time, in that her bodily difference to her husband suddenly seemed to matter more than it had in the past. Indeed, whereas physiological difference or roles associated with specific genders might potentially be downplayed in the time before children arrived, during the perinatal period, each parent is likely undergoing a deep kind of regendering. And all of these factors considered, it's not surprising that the transition to parenthood creates pretty complex feelings on both sides, bound to cause at least some disruption. This can create discourse when it comes to couple and family relationships, in that there can be difficulty in reconciling tensions between partnering and parenting, which are based on investments and commitments beyond individual choice. And I think that's where wherein lies the rub. But that is, whilst becoming a parent can be read as an exercise in self-expression, and I think our culture quite unhelpfully encourages us to do that, it's also about a moral responsibility beyond the self. So a tension between the desire to kind of be oneself and make a life with someone, as well as do the best for a child, is as difficult to resolve, if not more difficult, I think, for contemporary equal partners than ever. What we see here, sadly, is that the ideal of the reflexive, pure relationship is revealed to be very hard work, particularly after the arrival of children, as much as it makes absorbing the practical difficulties and indeed the joys of life quite difficult. So, just to finish, the examples here I hope have shown some of the ways in which the pervasive culture around parenting is gendered, and pointed to some of the impacts of that on women, as well as on men who can be left feeling ineffectual in how best to kind of support their partners. But more than that, I hope it's also shown the mental toll of this culture on couples who struggle to reconcile their concern with doing things equally and to do the best for their child. So the last word goes to Claudia, and this is in our sort of interview when the baby was a year old. And she says, I'm like a woman who's like a man, because I've always looked after myself financially, I'm independent, and I go and do my own things. And I don't have anyone dependent on me, except now I do. And suddenly I have to be a woman and a man. I have to be a loving and a mothering, nurturing person. And that's a massive conflict in my identity, because I've always shunned that. I don't know where that leaves us, and that's probably why, you know, my husband is saying, I don't really understand what 50-50 is, because you're doing everything, and now you want me to do everything that you're doing in the same way, but you've got everything covered. But obviously, I'm not actually coping. We'll leave it on that cheery note.
So a big thank you to Ellie for organizing this and for having me over. It's such a pleasure to be back here in Canterbury to talk about something I did some research about a few years back, but sort of revisiting breastfeeding as a topic is thrilling and very enjoyable. My name is Sunna Símonardóttir, yes, from the University of Iceland. And 11 years ago, I started my PhD, and don't worry, I have finished it. And at that time, my second daughter was 1 year old. So I had quite sort of recently gone through different stages of pregnancy, birth, feeding, caring for, and falling in love with a tiny little person. And during that time, I had noticed how certain aspects of this process of having a child had become quite sort of anxiety provoking, and this really sort of intrigued and infuriated me at the same time, which meant that this was, after all, the perfect topic for me to explore in much more detail for my PhD. But this anxiety that I referred to presented itself in various ways. But I was especially interested in seeing how food and feeding children, in particular, had become charged with significance and meaning. The cultural mandate being that Icelandic mothers were required to make their own nutritionally superb baby foods. There was also a lot of pressure for women to successfully breastfeed, preferably for a year or even longer. There was an unspoken rule that mothers shouldn't and couldn't really leave their children during the time when they were breastfeeding. They were not expected to need time for themselves away from their children. There was also pressure to aim for a vaginal unmedicated birth, which was positioned as both a natural and an empowering act for mothers. Maternity yoga classes and cloth diapering were also stressed as sort of important activities for mothers to pursue. And there was also this kind of common assumption that fathers didn't really have such an important role during the child's first year at least, due in most part to the necessity of exclusive breastfeeding. Now, all of those changes represented something altogether greater when examined in relation to each other. For me, there seemed to be a shift in the way that we as a society constructed the roles and responsibilities of mothers, especially mothers of young children. The implication was that mothering should be made harder, more difficult, and more time-consuming, and that your identity as a person should be based mostly on your role as a mother. This, as I later came to understand, is of course representative of the ideology of intensive mothering, as explained by Sharon Hayes in her book, The Cultural Contradictions of Motherhood. And this can be identified as an intensive, expert-led type of mothering. But this intensive style of mothering seemed to me to be particularly unsuitable or unsuited to the Icelandic context, where gender equality and shared parenting are presented as important goals, and where feminist rhetoric has been kind of successfully incorporated into both political discourse and sort of personal narratives at both sort of national and individual levels. So, as a card-carrying feminist, this lack of feminist engagement with mothering was surprising to me. And it was almost as if it was considered old-fashioned to think about mothering in critical terms. Perhaps it has also been thought to be quite sort of detrimental to the political goals of Icelandic feminists to deconstruct this symbol of the good mother, as sort of maternalism has carried considerable political weight and influence in the Icelandic context. So I eventually ended up basing my PhD study on the dominant discourses of motherhood in Iceland, and unsurprisingly, breastfeeding soon became a key issue. As we know, breastfeeding is both a private bodily act and a highly scrutinized gendered practice governed by medical professionals and discourses that intersect with broader discourses on motherhood and expected mothering behavior. Breastfeeding has proved to be an intriguing but often neglected subject for feminists, and for certain feminist discourses have been, as Crossley has noted, influential in promoting breastfeeding as a way of resisting the medicalization of childbirth and motherhood. So this celebration of breastfeeding can, of course, be seen as both liberating but simultaneously restrictive for women, as it can reinforce some of the more essentialist tendencies within gender discourse. Now, as we know, the World Health Organization recommends exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months of life, with continued breastfeeding up to 2 years of age or beyond. And this has become, of course, the optimal goal of policy and practice within healthcare systems around the world. Government health policies, antenatal classes, and healthcare professionals, books, and websites for expectant mothers all strongly promote breastfeeding as a superior infant feeding method. And in light of these sort of powerful biomedical discourses on the health benefits of breastfeeding and the common sense status that they have acquired, it's important to examine breastfeeding from a socio-cultural vantage point by looking at the lived implications of breastfeeding for women and how mothers in turn construct their infant feeding experiences. A little bit about the Icelandic context. Iceland has ranked as number 1 for over 10 consecutive years on the Gender Gap Index, which is published by the World Economic Forum, and sort of portrayed in the media quite commonly as a model country for gender equality and feminism. We've had a non-transferable parental leave quota for each parent in Iceland since the year 2000. And in the fall of 2020, a new legislation was passed that granted parents 12 months of paid parental leave, with 6 months assigned to each parent. So this is quite a radical law, as it involves a longer universal father's quota than is seen in most other countries, and the economic compensations are quite high by international standards. The female labor force participation in Iceland is almost comparable to that of men, And Iceland is generally categorized as belonging to the Nordic welfare model, where the dual breadwinner, dual carer model is in place. The prevalence of breastfeeding is traditionally very high in the Scandinavian countries, where we have witnessed an upward trend towards higher breastfeeding rates and duration. Almost all Icelandic mothers initiate breastfeeding, and breastfeeding rates for children in Iceland remain at a high level. And the sort of current public health emphasis in Iceland is therefore more focused on encouraging mothers to breastfeed exclusively for at least 6 months. The high breastfeeding rates in Iceland and other Nordic countries should therefore be considered a direct result of those kind of cultural expectations, as well as, of course, other supportive structural conditions. Now, a little bit about the study I did. Through my data collection for my PhD, it became apparent to me that the pressure on mothers to be able to breastfeed and the importance that is placed on breastfeeding could be considered one of the biggest sites of normalization and discipline of the maternal body and mind. And considering that, I felt it was most interesting to look at the experiences of those who fail in this sort of culture of breastfeeding. The women who had struggled with breastfeeding or had been unable to breastfeed. So I wanted to explore their experiences. I advertised the study and asked women who had experienced problems with breastfeeding or not been able to breastfeed to submit their narratives to me. And 77 women did so. And I approached the narratives sort of asking what moral work was being undertaken by the participants and how they described their experiences, as well as how they kind of construct themselves and their interactions with healthcare specialists and sort of, this sort of breastfeeding journey that they had. I was interested in looking at the discursive space that the participants inhabit and how and if they challenge dominant discourses on breastfeeding and what it means to be a good, responsible mother. So, the biomedical discourse that has achieved dominance within our cultural climate considers breastfeeding to be a matter of individual choice. And although all the Icelandic mothers in this study wanted to breastfeed, they all experienced severe difficulties, such as damaged nipples, mastitis, yeast infection, or great pain. For some, the milk supply was low or non-existent. For others, the milk supply decreased over time. Some mothers were not able to establish any breastfeeding. Others were able to breastfeed for a short period of time, and a number of mothers encountered problems for weeks and even months, but were able to carry on with breastfeeding eventually. So the women who encountered problems with their milk supply were encouraged by healthcare professionals to increase the number of feeds dramatically, and additionally, use an electric breast pump between feeds to enhance milk production. For many of the women, this meant that they spent their days and nights either trying to breastfeed or when their babies were sleeping, expressing milk with the breast pump. For many of the women, this project, trying to establish breastfeeding, was so extensive that it took over every aspect of their lives. There was no time to enjoy the baby or do anything else. There was sort of all-encompassing projects. Now, when it comes to failing to achieve something that is meant to be both easy and natural, the women were quick to blame themselves for that which their bodies did not produce. And for most of them, this struggle to breastfeed was totally unexpected and very difficult to come to terms with. As good mothers, they must prioritize their baby's interests ahead of their own, and often sacrifice their own emotional and physical well-being in order to do so. Giving up breastfeeding is not constructed as a legitimate choice at this point, as the women's stories so clearly revealed. Instead, they must try everything in their power to persist with breastfeeding, and in order to do so, most of them consult with specialists, nurses, midwives, and lactation consultants, whose kind of authoritative status affords them the right to communicate the rules of successful feeding. Some of the women constructed themselves as almost completely passive and even submissive, where they have kind of lost all control over their actions and bodies, and midwives and other healthcare professionals make them do and try various things to help with the breastfeeding. Others admit to simply being afraid of healthcare professionals. It has been noted how pregnant women are kept under surveillance and expected to act in ways that are deemed responsible to the baby they carry and to themselves. And this holds true for breastfeeding mothers as well, who have to account for their feeding choices to friends, family members, and even strangers. Scientific truths on infant feeding and good mothering do not exist in a vacuum solely confined to hospitals or health clinics, and the long list of assumed benefits of breastfeeding have also become common sense. And some of the women found that their breastfeeding, or lack thereof, was an acceptable topic of conversation, even with strangers. Now, as Google has noted, breastfeeding operates as a signal issue, which assigns women into different parenting camps. And without a thorough examination of the structural underpinnings of breastfeeding, it becomes almost impossible for women to understand their failures as anything other than a personal shortcoming. Interference and unsolicited advice and attention from strangers means that the women start to expect being under surveillance, preparing for the hostile gaze of others, with a list of excuses ready at the tip of their tongues. So Erla explains this feeling of being under surveillance in this quote. She says, "No one has given me a hostile look or told me that this isn't good for my children, but still I keep on making excuses." So the surveillance is now sustained on an interpersonal level, where the mothers are monitored not only by others, but also by themselves. Through the narratives, the mothers did contest certain aspects of professionals' infant feeding advice by constructing counter discourses of their own, where they represent themselves and their infant feeding experiences as legitimate. Now, the cornerstone of all dominant medical discourses on breastfeeding states that breast milk offers considerable health benefits over formula. So even though the women did not directly challenge this overall assumption, some of them do contest the universality of such claims by contrasting their own happy, healthy, and smart children with the image of formula-fed children as deprived and less healthy. Another example of dominant breastfeeding discourse that the Icelandic mothers challenge is this idea that bonding between mother and child primarily takes place through breastfeeding. So this is refuted by the women presenting their negative experiences of breastfeeding as a counter discourse. where breastfeeding is stressful, it's painful, it can lead to postnatal depression and anxiety, and therefore directly sort of interferes with bonding. Some mothers reject the notion of bonding through breastfeeding by constructing their experiences of breastfeeding as simply being uncomfortable and unenjoyable. That being said, constructing formula as a good option is only possible if breastfeeding has been sort of tried and it just doesn't work. So they have to sort of try everything in their power, and then they can sort of go with the formula. So constructing formula as a good option is only possible if breastfeeding no longer seems possible. This discursive shift of formula from secondary to the best option can only be achieved if the mother has truly tried and failed to establish breastfeeding. The same can be said about fathers' involvement in infant feeding through the use of formula. Then the mothers have to negotiate kind of two positions at once. On the one hand, feeling happy to share the responsibilities more equally, and on the other hand, adhering to this dominant discourse of good mothering, which proclaims that infant feeding and care is primarily the mother's domain. And this quote by Ausa, I think, kind of perfectly captured this tension. She said, with the formula, I in fact felt more free as a result, not as tied down with the baby, and there was more equality in the parenting roles. Then I got a guilty conscience about thinking like that. That is just how complicated this really is. So, even though I can identify several counter discourses in the women's narratives, somewhat surprisingly, just to me, almost none of them utilize any type of feminist rhetoric to refute dominant discourses on breastfeeding or motherhood. And similarly, notions of equality and shared parental responsibilities do not feature as themes in their narratives. And this was surprising to me, as feminist discourses are common and pronounced in Icelandic society, like I said at the beginning, sort of ranging from the political to the personal. And counter discourses could, I think, play a more important role. For example, challenging the dominant discourses on infant feeding by identifying how the demands made on mothers are made on the basis of their biology and other essentialist understandings. These counter discourses could also be constructed around the need for equality between the sexes when it comes to caring for infants, right from the start. They could also address how this excessive focus on getting mothers to breastfeed hinders the mother from being a truly autonomous person, as she is kind of required to stay constantly close to the child, as well as pointing out how breastfeeding has become this kind of signal issue which assigns women into different parenting camps, and thereby sort of promotes and perhaps directly causes conflict and even a sense of competition between mothers. So, to conclude, the goal of this study was to ask individuals to share their stories in an environment where their experiences are often marginalized and pathologized. The research that has been done on breastfeeding from this sort of socio-cultural vantage point was very much rooted in a kind of Anglo-American context and mostly conducted in countries where breastfeeding rates remain relatively low, and the cultural context of breastfeeding is quite similar. So my work on Icelandic mothers who struggle with breastfeeding was an attempt to address that sort of gap in our knowledge by bringing to view the experiences of women struggling to breastfeed in a culture that proclaims that breast is not only best, but that breastfeeding really is the only option. Yeah.
Hello, your thoughts? Thank you, Ellie, for having me here today, and to Charlotte and Sunna for those papers. I was reading your work before I came today, and one of the things, one of the things I was thinking about, having just had a child myself and gone through all of this in the last 7 months, is how the narrative around having children, particularly when you're pregnant, I mean, you're fed constantly the message from midwives that this is your birth, it's your thing, it's all about you. You know, please write out your birth plan and tell me what playlist you want for it. You know, it's very sort of personalized. And then within the, hours or maybe a few days in which you give birth, or sort of almost overnight, that is completely out of the window, and there is a very specific way in which you have to do things, and a very prescribed way of being a mother, to the extent that, I mean, I had an emergency cesarean and woke up with my child on my chest. No, it was a given that this was something I was going to do, despite the fact that I was semi-conscious. So there is that kind of, Charlotte, you in your book on the second page, you use this phrase where you talk about the extraordinary cognitive dissonance of having a child, which, reading that, I just thought that is, it's the kind of dirty secret of giving birth, which is that as much as your mother or your grandmother or friends who've been there and have forgotten the kind of difficulties of the first few weeks tell you that everything is so wonderful, you'll never be as happy as you are in your life, that actually the shock of losing the independence that Claudia talked about and becoming mum, this different person and this different entity, it can be extremely alienating, and something which I think breastfeeding just exemplifies in the extreme, in which you are literally overnight no longer a sort of solid independent entity, and you're expected to be connected to this other person. And I suppose the thing that I wanted to add into the discussion, particularly relating to Sunna's points about why there's been no feminist, or very little kind of feminist critique of this kind of thing, is the way in which we talk about women's breasts, and the way in which we talk about breastfeeding as if they are sort of attached to the wall and all you've got to do is squeeze them and feed the baby, rather than them being actually attached to a woman. And that, that any question about me as a woman wouldn't feed into my approach to breastfeeding, and particularly how this relates to sex. So it sort of fascinated me that throughout pregnancy, most women, your boobs get really big, and if you're in a heterosexual relationship, your husband or partner might enjoy that. You kind of, there's something sexy about big breasts for many people. You are obviously in the process of trying to have a child, you're having lots of sex, and you are, there is your breasts perform for many women a certain kind of function, in that they exist in the adult world of sex and relationships. You wear low cut tops, you see yourself, your breasts are part of your identity as a woman, and all the kind of sexual connotations that come from that. And again, almost overnight, then that's gone, and the breasts are owned by this little thing in your arms, and any question that they might remain in that adult world of sex and relationships is gone. And it was something that I couldn't ever get to grips with. I mean, particularly on the larger end of the cup size, the idea that I would be getting out my 34 Gs in a cafe and that be absolutely fine was just, I couldn't conceive of doing that. I couldn't conceive of being able to do it in front of my parents, as liberal and wonderful as they are. This was not something that I wanted to do. And yet the kind of the messaging that I got constantly from, it has to be said, I think the NHS has a lot to answer for in regards to this, the way in which, you know, okay, if you're not going to breastfeed, you must do skin to skin contact at the very least, made you feel exceptionally guilty about admitting not that breastfeeding was difficult or, you know, all these other excuses, but that maybe I just don't want to do this, that maybe actually these things might remain mine, and not belong, at least in part, to this other person. And it's very tempting to indulge in anecdote, and I won't do it too much, but I'll just tell you this little story about, which I think exemplifies something about the total removal of actually women's dignity in relation to breastfeeding, which was, you know, despite the fact that I've been involved with Ellie and CPCS for a long time before I was pregnant, and I thought I had all the politics around it and thought I knew exactly what was going to happen. Inevitably, once my son was born, you know, you're a very vulnerable position, and you switch immediately into forgetting every feminist seminar you ever went to, and was very much in the zone of, this is breastfeeding is something I have to at least try, or I will forever regret ever having a go at it. And it was very difficult, and I couldn't do it. But there was one point at which a lactation consultant had come to my house, and the advice was that I should be naked, or should be topless at least. It would be more beneficial. I actually just heard the word naked, so I completely stripped off and sat sweating on my sofa. I think this was about 6 days in, and it was me, the lactation consultant, who was male, and my husband and this baby, everybody trying to wrestle with nipple shields. And I sort of caught out the corner of my eye my husband's face and realized how deeply uncomfortable he was, not just with the fact that there was another guy looking at me naked, but also that, you know, it was just a situation I've never ever been in, that I suddenly had, including my son, 3 men looking at me naked, sweating on a sofa. And it was at that point that I thought, what is going on here? You know, why is no one considering how I feel about this as a woman? And so, you know, I think the fact that the total dismissal of the idea that women's bodies do actually, and their sense of self does not change overnight, and that it does take quite a long time to inhabit the role of mother, and that you have to learn how to do it, not through reading books or going to seminars, but through doing it. You have to get to know this kid. You have to get to know yourself and your partner in a new relationship. Is that reality is not reflected in the very authoritarian approach to breastfeeding. And so I think that you know, maybe we can talk about this. I think all of us, if we're honest with ourselves, know that there is a nervousness about talking about formula feeding, not as a positive option, not as maybe even as something attractive, you know, that's something you would want to do, but as the other option, as the safe kind of, as the fallback, or as the kind of next best thing. And I think that we need to start, you know, it's not that I want to suddenly you know, denigrate anyone who wants to breastfeed. I'm sure I know that lots of people find it a very pleasurable and easy experience. But I think we need to push the envelope and say that bottle feeding is a positive choice in and of itself, and not qualify it with anything about that kind of explanation. I mean, Sunna, your point about breastfeeding being both a private bodily act and a highly scrutinized gender practice is, I just think, so incredibly key, that if feeding a child is meant to be a sort of personal experience, then, you know, whether or not how you choose to do it shouldn't be up for grabs. And just, you know, I think we should make infant feeding mundane again, which is that to take the sting out of it. I mean, there's the woman downstairs from me has just had a child, which is very good for noise disturbance between both of us. And we meet each other periodically, walking our kids to try and get them to sleep around the park. And she's breastfeeding, and she as I can hear, is having an extremely hard time with it. And I said to her, well, might you try, tried bottle feeding, it makes them sleep longer. And her back instantly arched, and she was very upset that I'd said that. And it's anecdotally, again, it's highly unscientific research, but in all the kind of baby groups that I go to, I am the only one who bottle feeds. And that goes for the kind of middle class groups I go to in Stoke Newington and the more working class groups I go to in Leighton and Dalston. And there is the saddest thing is that there's a real lack of solidarity among women, because people feel so incredibly defensive about it. And to the point where, you know, women might talk in these baby groups about bleeding nipples, and the minute you use the F word for formula, they get very, very upset. And I think that's just so wrong. So I think we need to be a lot harsher on the kind of lactivist approach that has infected a lot of NHS guidance, but also the kind of actually call feminists bluff a lot and say that if we are serious about women being free in their choices and serious about bodily autonomy, that has to extend to not just abortion, not just other things, but the way in which we bring up children. So I'm just delighted that you've written those papers. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ella. We've got about 20 minutes till we have some coffee. So what would anybody like to comment on?